Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the deep end, mapping out the absolute core ideological divides in our modern culture. We're doing this by breaking down a truly fascinating multi-hour panel debate. Imagine two completely opposite worlds colliding. You've got a prominent conservative commentator on one side and a group of progressive activists and adult content creators on the other. So we're going to see exactly what happens when deeply traditional views crash head-on into progressive, non-traditional lifestyles. And look, this isn't just theory, right? It's a raw, unfiltered look at how completely differently people view the fundamental building blocks of human connection and how those huge differences are quite literally rewiring the modern dating market. Okay, here's our roadmap to make sense of this wild conversation. First, the modern cultural divide. Second, hookup, culture, and marriage. Third, political deal breakers. Fourth, debating gender and feminism. And finally, number 5, the abortion debate. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the modern cultural divide. Now, before we can even talk about dating, we really have to figure out what each side is actually looking for. The conservative host sets up this really interesting historical framework. You see, while we use the English word love as a catch-all for everything, the ancient Greeks actually broke it down into specific types. And it's right here, in these distinct categories, especially agape, which is the highest form of self-sacrificing love, where we spot the panel's first massive split. On one side, you have the progressive panelists who view love much more functionally. To them, it's defined as a fluid emotional connection, a space of unconditional acceptance. But crucially, they heavily prioritize self-love. In fact, one panelist mentioned she focuses intensely on loving herself first, largely because she's afraid of the commitment and, honestly, the potential pain of giving absolutely everything to someone else. Well, the conservative view completely flips that script. The host argues that the ultimate goal of love isn't just chasing an emotional connection, but actually embracing absolute self-sacrifice, that agape we just mentioned. He makes the case that this is best realized through a stable, traditional marriage and raising kids. His argument? That coming home to a family gives you a profound, lasting joy that easily trumps any temporary emotional high.
Which brings us to part 2, hookup culture and marriage.
It turns out this deep philosophical divide over love directly dictates how each side views intimacy. The progressive side tends to see sex as this shareable energy exchange, right? It's a fun, physical act that doesn't inherently need to be tied to a lifelong commitment. But the traditional view counters hard against that, arguing that sex is a sacred, biological, and spiritual pair bond that is exclusively reserved for one single person inside of a marriage. To really highlight this gap, a progressive adult content creator on the panel makes a fascinating point. She argues that her sex work actually empowers her. She genuinely believes that exploring physical intimacy outside of her primary relationship strengthens her romantic bond, simply because it demands so much communication and trust. For her, it's a true passion and an exhibitionist art form. Conversely, the conservative host issues a really stark warning against this entire lifestyle. He argues that modern hookup culture and pornography are essentially highly addictive drugs. Pulling from the research of experts like Dr. Anna Lempke and Gary Wilson, he points out that these constant short-term dopamine hits create a literal chemical dependency. He argues it's physically rewiring the brain, ultimately leading to a massive dopamine drain and severe depression, especially among young men. Let's move on to part 3, political deal breakers in dating. So we have to ask, how do these deeply personal views on intimacy and biology spill over into the real world? Think about it for a second. In today's fiercely polarized climate, could you successfully date someone with completely opposing political views? The panel shared some incredibly revealing stories about exactly this scenario. Interestingly, several of the progressive panelists were actually totally open to dating across the political aisle. One even joked about hoping she could slowly shift her liberal boyfriend further to the left. But the conservative host strongly warns against this. He argues that marriage is tough enough on its own without trying to navigate fundamentally clashing worldviews. And hey, he might have a point. One progressive panelist laughingly recounted a date that crashed and burned in literally 20 minutes once they realized their extreme political incompatibility. So what exactly is driving this massive wedge between men and women right now? The panel pinpointed a few key culprits. A progressive organizer pointed to the online radicalization of young men by alternative media. But in a really interesting moment of concession, she also admitted that modern feminism has, in some ways, left men behind without clear answers, creating a sort of cultural vacuum for that radicalization to take root in the first place. Now let's tackle part 4, debating gender and feminism. Before jumping into the deepest divisions, the progressive panelists actually took a moment to establish a unified definition of feminism. They laid it out clearly as a movement focused on total social, political, and economic equality across all genders. It's a very broad, very inclusive definition aimed entirely at systemic parity. But here's the catch. That very inclusive definition leads directly to what is easily one of the most contentious questions in the entire explainer. What is a woman? It sounds like a deceptively simple question, right? But it prompts fiercely defended and completely opposite answers from the two sides. And here is the clear split. The progressive panelists define womanhood functionally, as a social performance. To them, it's an energy, a mindset, or presenting as society's conception of what a woman is. The traditional host, however, completely rejects this framework. He defines a woman strictly through objective biological reality, pointing to XX chromosomes and physical anatomy as fundamental truths that existed way before modern gender theory. From there, the debate dives straight into the science. The progressive side argues that gender differences mostly stem from social conditioning. They point out that what we consider masculine or feminine is super fluid and changes drastically across different cultures and eras. The conservative host counters with biological determinism. He cites a Harvard study suggesting that men and women innately process thoughts differently on a neurological level, making the case that biology, not just society, hardwires these distinct realities. Finally, we arrive at part 5, the abortion debate. This is the absolute peak of the ideological fault line. The conversation centers on a profoundly sensitive question: when does human life actually begin? For the progressive side, the answers vary pretty widely. Some say life begins at consciousness, others say when there's a heartbeat, and some argue a fetus isn't fully human until birth. But the conservative side, they are completely uncompromising on this point. Life begins at conception. To put the sheer scale of this issue into perspective, the conservative host presents a really stark statistic. He points out that there are over 1 million abortions annually in the U.S. He then immediately contrasts that number against the estimated 2 million people who are currently waiting to adopt a child. From his traditional standpoint, he argues that the very concept of an unwanted child simply shouldn't exist given those numbers. And that perfectly summarizes the ultimate deadlock between the two sides. The progressive panelists stand absolutely firm on bodily autonomy. They argue that women should not be forced to take on the massive responsibility and profound financial burden of a child they simply aren't prepared for. On the flip side, the conservative host vehemently defends fetal life, viewing the procedure as a tragedy driven by an industry that, in his view, fails to give women true, informed consent about the realities of the procedure. We've just mapped out some truly massive divides in how people view love, sex, politics, gender, and the very beginning of life itself. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. If our foundational definitions of reality are this polarized, what does the future of modern relationships actually look like? Can these two cultural extremes ever truly find common ground, or are we looking at a permanent fracture in how society connects? Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.